I hope you enjoy this short video from Clements Hall Local History Group, which we've made to explain to you what we've discovered about conscience and the call to arms in World War I. We've discovered that there were 13 conscientious objectors from this local area. We've also discovered that there were a number of people who objected to serving in the war for various other reasons, not necessarily connected with conscience. Before 1916, Britain across continental Europe was unique in that it didn't compel by law its men to fight in its wars. However, by 1916, as the war dragged on and became ever bigger, the government decided that some degree of compulsion must be brought about, and the Military Service Act was passed in 1916. This compelled men within a certain age range to join up for the war. However, again, uniquely, the Act had a conscience clause in it, so that if you felt on the grounds of conscience that you couldn't engage with the war, you could appeal through a series of local tribunals for exemption on these grounds. You also could appeal against conscription if you felt you were in work which was essential to the war effort or otherwise needed directly or indirectly for the war, and you could also appeal if your family would be put to hardship or any other hardship by joining up. I'm standing in York Council Chamber in the Guildhall, and this is undoubtedly where some of our conscientious objectors would have had their appeals heard by the local tribunal. As you can see, it's a very, very intimidating building, and many of the conscientious objectors here would have taken an act of bravery in itself to arrive here before the tribunal, some of them in their very early 20s. There were 10 people altogether on the tribunal, including Alderman Sir Joseph Sykes-Rymer, a JP and Tory, and the City Sheriff and the Lord Mayor. The tribunals then split into two courts and held tribunals in another room in the Guildhall, equally as imposing and intimidating as this one. We know that they had a lot of cases to get through. Nationally, during the war, 20,000 people appealed on grounds of conscience alone. But as well as that, as we know, they were hearing appeals from local tradespeople who were frightened that sending their employees to war would result in the collapse of their businesses. They were hearing appeals from people from very humble backgrounds who were appealing on the grounds of hardship to be exempted from military service. And we know that from the local press and from documents held at North Yorkshire County Records Office.
The Heritage Lottery funded Grounds for Appeal project, run at the North Yorkshire County Record Office, is summarising and cataloguing the Appeal Tribunal papers which were sent to the North Riding Appeal Tribunal from 1916 to 1918. In 1921, the Board of Health issued an instruction that all these tribunal papers should be destroyed because of the sensitive nature of the content. However, by an oversight, or whatever, this collection of papers has survived. They were stored in bundles covered in brown paper, which conveniently had on the side Military Service Act 1916 Appeal Tribunals. However, we didn't realise the significance of what these bundles contained until we opened them following the National Archives survey, which asked what significant papers do you have concerning World War I, and then we found the collection, approximately 6,000 cases. The Appeal Tribunal papers that were sent to the North Riding are on a pink form. Prior to this, they went to the local tribunal, in this instance York City Tribunal. The men would appeal on various grounds. One would be, I want to continue in my current occupation. If you're not happy with that, I can go to a second occupation. A third one would be education and training. There could be ill health in the family, or it could be his own ill health. And also there was conscientious objection and then exempt occupations. So they could appeal on any of these grounds at all. For the Clement Hall project, we're looking specifically at the appeals that went from the York City Tribunal to the North Riding Appeal Tribunal. When they went originally to the local tribunal, the conscientious objectors from May 1916 would have to complete a questionnaire of 10 questions, which would then look at what their grounds exactly were for conscientious objection. And these answers could then be questioned in an open court, because all the hearings, unless there was something very sensitive happening, were held in open court, and the newspapers would then report on all these cases.
I'm looking now at two very distinct sets of appeals. One of them is from William Varley, conscientious objector. He never once mentions religion in his appeal. He seems to be a very a-religious character, who quite providently for us has provided letters of support for the appeal tribunal from various people that he worked with and that he knew. We've got one letter of support from Charles Parkin at Albemarle Road, who says that he does not personally believe in the same things that Varley believes in, but that he is a good and upstanding person and is definitely willing to support him at the appeal level. However, Varley mentions on his appeal to the North Yorkshire Tribunal that these letters of support weren't read out at local tribunal level. He also mentions that his appeal at local level was listened to with some degree of impatience and interruptions. Another of the conscientious objectors has a completely different stance when he writes his appeal. He's Percy Rosewarne, and his appeal papers are littered, I would say, with quotations from the Bible, all very correctly referenced to illustrate why he's appealing to the tribunal. When asked on his appeal papers to state precisely on what grounds he bases his objection to combatant service, he very clearly replies, framed with a Bible quote, St. Matthew 5, verses 21-22, "Thou shalt not kill. Whosoever shall kill shall be in danger of judgment." And it goes on in that vein throughout his appeal papers. Percy was quite absolute in his beliefs in not wishing to engage with or play a part in the war. For his beliefs, he was eventually thrown out of this house at number 13 Kime Street, where he lived with his aunt, and had to go and live at Balmoral Terrace. He refused to do overtime at the NER because he saw that this was indirectly a way of helping towards the war. They were short of labour there and required the men who were there to do overtime because many of the men had gone to the front. Eventually, Percy Rosewarne served time for his beliefs in Pentonville, Wandsworth Prison and Wormwood Scrubs. Percy Rosewarne's unusual in that he actually served as a soldier before World War I. He joined the army as a very young boy in 1905. He had come out of the army by 1916 and actually tried to join up. He went with some friends to the recruitment office, and when he was told that he and his friends couldn't all be in the same fighting unit, they went away from the recruitment office in disgust. Sometime after that, Percy changed his mind about the war and eventually was imprisoned for his beliefs in not wanting to fight at all or engage with the war in any way. I'm standing outside at number 6 Kime Street here, where George Broadley, one of our conscientious objectors, lived in 1916. He was absolute in his beliefs against fighting in the war. In 1917, he was arrested as an absentee from the army, court-martialed, and eventually he was sentenced to many prison sentences with hard labour. A question was raised in 1919 in Parliament about whether his sentence could be remitted. So we know that he was still in prison in May 1919 in Wormwood Scrubs. He also served prison sentences in Wandsworth and Pentonville and would very probably have been in Wandsworth and Pentonville prisons at the same time as Percy Rosewarne, also from Kime Street. by the graveside of Fred Wickenden, and his argument not to fight in the war was based on religious conviction. There were a lot of Quakers involved in the movement against fighting in the First World War. Fred, he started out as a primitive Methodist, but by the beginning of the war he'd started to go to Quaker meetings. He'd organised a lot of debates around pacifism on the primitive Methodist circuit and seemed to have been very strongly against fighting and killing people. In 1916 he appealed to the local tribunal and applied for absolute exemption. The appeal tribunal granted him exemption from combat service on the proviso that he should find work of national importance within a month. It seems that he did this because by 1917 we have records of him working at Mapleton Nut Food Company in Liverpool, which seems to have been a Quaker-owned company. By 1918, it seems he had met his wife, Sarah Elsie Cooper, and he married her in July 1918 in the John Bright Library at Bootham School, because the Quaker meeting house in York was being used as a military hospital. But sadly, by November, he had died as a result of the Spanish flu pandemic, which swept the world in 1918. I'm very pleased to be in City of York Council's Archives Reading Room at Explore in York, and here we are looking at the scrapbook of William Varley, who was one of our local conscientious objectors. This scrapbook shows us a great deal about what it was like to be in prison as a conscientious objector during the First World War. It's clear from the archive that William had intended to keep a collection of correspondence that he sent to his wife from prison, because he says in one of the letters to his wife, "Please hold on to this for our collection." It also throws light on William's relationship with his wife Edith. Whenever he's allowed to write letters out of prison, he wrote daily to her. He has in the scrapbook an account of a funeral of a conscientious objector who had been imprisoned in Wormwood Scrubs and then was subsequently transferred to Williams Prison later on, where he died of consumption. According to William, because of the horrendous conditions for conscientious objectors during that time. He gives a very moving written account of the funeral service itself, of the prisoners lining up by the sides of the corridors to watch the body go past with their hats off, and later on of the prison service for the funeral. And William was astonished to note that there was a huge turnout from the prisoners for this service. It seems that nearly everyone at the prison attended, whether they were religious or not, whether they were conscientious objectors or not. Also in this archive, there's a collection of postcards that somehow or other have been taken in prison by photographers and then sent out of prisons to supporters of conscientious objectors. These two photographs here together show firstly a picture of William Varley before he would have gone into prison. I think this photograph is taken in 1914. By the side of it is a prisoner with the title "On the Stool," which looks remarkably like William Varley not being allowed to stand on his prison stool to look out of the prison window. In this archive we've got various pieces of documentation which relate to the rules and regulations that he would have undergone in prison and to the procedures that he had to go through both as a conscientious objector and as a prisoner. We've got evidence here of William's call-up papers asking him to report to Easing Wold Recruitment Office. Interestingly, there's not just one request for him to appear, there will have been at least two, because I've got a final request for him to appear at the recruitment office. He obviously failed to report on at least one other occasion. We've also got a charge sheet relating to William's time when he was in the non-combatant corps, detailing the circumstances under which he failed to obey an order, which resulted in him being imprisoned. We've got various letters from North Riding County Records Office about his appeal to go to the Central Tribunal, which was turned down. But the military authorities specially asked that his case was heard again, and this was heard at Wormwood Scrubs. The result seems to have been that William convinced the tribunal to the extent that he was given work of national importance. We've got a letter written by the office from Wormwood Scrubs telling William's wife that he's about to be released to do work under the National Committee. And also we've got correspondence written on prison note paper where William's required just to fill the blanks in a particular pro forma. And there's another form, again written on prison note paper, to say to his wife that he's decided to accept work of national importance.
We're here in the National Railway Museum beside the ambulance train exhibit because one of our conscientious objectors, Edmund Cooper, spent the war working for the Friends Ambulance Unit, 3 years of which he spent on a train just like this, transporting wounded men from medical clearing stations to the docks in France to be brought to Britain and made better, sometimes to be sent back. Edmund's an example of an alternativist, of somebody who didn't want, for reasons of his Quaker background and pacifist beliefs, to be a combatant, but did want to contribute to the war effort. Edmund was born in 1894 and he was 20 on the outbreak of war. He lived at 16 Wentworth Road in the Scarcroft area of York, and his parents were pacifists and Quakers. He left school at the age of 15 and continued his education under his own steam by going to an adult school in St Mary's in York. This was largely Quaker and strongly socialist. He decided to enlist in the Royal Army Medical Corps and set off to the Leeds office, but found that it was shut. And on his way back, he was intercepted by somebody who'd been sent by Arnold Rowntree to tell him that he should actually join the Friends Ambulance Unit. Arnold Rowntree was the Quaker Liberal MP for York, later responsible for ensuring that there was a conscience clause in the Military Service Act of 1916. The Friends Ambulance Unit was the initiative of individual Quakers rather than of the Society of Friends as a whole, and it was offering a way in which young Quakers could contribute to the war without taking on combatant roles. After basic training in first aid in Jordan's, the training camp in Buckinghamshire of the Friends Ambulance Unit, Edmund set off and helped first to construct cholera hospitals in northern France where there had been epidemics of cholera. And after this, he joined his train, which was Ambulance Train 16, which is why we're here in the National Railway Museum, because Ambulance Train 16 is very like the train on display here. At first, life on the train seemed frustratingly quiet, and Edmund and the rest of the staff seemed to spend ages polishing brass and keeping this brand new train in spotless condition. And this wasn't quite what he had in mind, really. But quite soon, things changed, and the train was called upon to collect loads of very badly damaged men. Often the train would be packed so that you could hardly move in it, with every space taken up with somebody who was in pain and needing help. Sometimes the shifts to get the soldiers from where they'd been picked up to the ports would take 36 hours, and it was 36 hours of non-stop back-breaking work. At the end of which the train was in a really filthy state and really needed to be cleaned. And this was again, 24 hours on top. So there were exhausting stints before more quiet periods. In early 1918, Edmund transferred to a motorised ambulance convoy attached to a French division. He learnt to drive. He liked this life very much because it was very active, and he had much more control over what he did. It was in this role that he won the Croix de Guerre for, with his co-driver, rescuing 10 French officers under direct shell fire. We're lucky to have so much information about Edmund Cooper because his diaries, his letters, and various other documents relating to his service with the Friends Ambulance Unit are kept in the Liddell collection of the Brotherton Library in the University of Leeds.
I'm standing outside York People's Dispensary in Duncan Place because this was a very important building for one of the people that we've researched. And that person was Charles Wilfred Coughlin, who volunteered his services here from before the war right through until 1923. At the time war broke out, he was 35 years old. He'd been an amateur heavyweight boxing champion in Scotland when he was a medical student up in Edinburgh. As well as working here, he also volunteered his services as a doctor to give lectures to the local voluntary aid detachment volunteers and did a lot of work for them. His primary job was as a GP, and he ran a medical practice in partnership with one Dr. Waitman at number 1 East Mount Road, and they had 3,000 patients on their books. Charles didn't apply on conscience grounds against military service. He applied because he was saying that he was doing certified work and that his job as a doctor was essential to the war. He argued to the tribunal that were he to be sent off to war, it would have been very difficult for Dr. Waitman to carry on running his practice. He'd recently amalgamated the practice with Dr. Waitman because Dr. Waitman had been in poor health, and Charles Wilfred Coughlin felt he would put at risk the health of 3,000 of his patients were he to be called up for war. This, I think, quite clearly illustrates how many people had to face the pull between keeping local services going and going up to war, and trying to find a line and reach a decision about that. In response to his appeal, the local tribunal said that the Army, the Royal Army Medical Corps, needed all the young single men it could get to service the war. They must have persuaded Charles because he withdrew his appeal, but asked for some time to make alternative arrangements for his practice. And the appeal tribunal had suggested it would be relatively easy for Charles to get a male partner for Dr. Waitman to cover his absence in the practice. It wasn't until September that Charles eventually joined the Royal Army Medical Corps. The appeal took place in April, and he was criticised in the press for the amount of time it took for him to eventually join the Royal Army Medical Corps. He did service in Salonika on the Macedonian front, and it turned out that sickness and death from malaria and the poor conditions there claimed more lives than the actual fighting had done. Charles survived the war and came back to York, where he worked here as an honorary medical officer until 1923.
We're here here at Nunthorpe Court, now Millthorpe School, home of Richard Frederick Maisie Thompson, who lived here from 1880 until around 1920. And Richard was the son of Lord Knaresborough, who lived nearby at Kirby Hall. Richard's whole family were military, with many associations with the Rifle Brigade and also political. Colonel Maisie Thompson could always be relied upon to give a good quote to the newspapers, and one of his particular peeves was conscientious objectors. From his military background, had no time for conscientious objectors at all. Indeed, in one letter to the newspapers was reported as saying that they should be dressed in red and distributed along the front line, their task being to dig graves for the fallen soldiers, and his suggestion that Verdun would be a good place to start, Verdun of course being one of the longest and major battles of World War I. His land extends to about 35 acres, and he's got cows, sheep and poultry, and 2 men employed to help him look after the land and the animals, an Arthur Ennison and Walter Porter. And the Walter Porter episode became known as quite a local scandal. Despite Colonel Maisie Thompson's objection to conscientious objectors, when it came a little bit closer to home, he didn't quite have the same views. His 2 agricultural workers, or horsemen, Walter Porter and Arthur Ennison, were called up, and Maisie Thompson appealed against their call upon the basis that they were needed to help him run the estate and the cow herd particularly, and the dairy. He appealed, and the appeal went through a succession of tribunals, but was overturned on the basis that effectively the herd was only serving the Maisie Thompson household and employees. Interestingly, however, the Board of Agriculture seemed to intervene in the case and said that Walter Porter was engaged in agriculture and had to stay, and this caused furore locally, and the local tribunal went on strike for about 3 weeks, which was quite unusual, saying, you know, we're in an impossible situation here. Our decision for this man to be called up is being overturned. However, we've just said that somebody else has to be called up, and their herd served 200 people. There then seemed to be an intervention from the Northern Command, who said, this guy's got to go, and eventually he was called up. However, July 1917, he is still working at Nunthorpe Court, so who knows quite whether he ever got called up into service. Some people have been critical of Richard Maisie Thompson's approach, and you can see why. However, he did have this estate to look after. He was in his late 60s, early 70s. How was he going to look after the land without any help? It perhaps is no surprise that at the end of the First World War, he sold up quite quickly and moved to Scarborough.
Now we've come to the end of our video. Perhaps it's time to reflect on what we've learned. We know that all of the people we've researched faced challenges, hostility, and rifts with family, friends, and neighbours. We've only managed to skim the surface of what's available on our website, so if you want to find out more about some more fascinating stories about our objectors to the war, please look at our website. George Broadley never would have expected, I don't think, to have still been in prison after the end of World War I doing hard labour. Charles Coughlin, our GP from East Mount Road, would never have expected to be treating malaria and dysentery in foul conditions in Macedonia. Edmund Cooper from Wentworth Road would never ever have expected to have been awarded the Croix de Guerre. We know from our research looking through the local press of the day that on a weekly and sometimes a daily basis there were letters from the people from York protesting about what they thought were the shirkers and slackers who didn't engage with the war. We know also that some of the employees from Cook's in Bishop Hill, who were a big employer in the area, faced hostility, when they were harangued by the Roundtree's workers during their lunch hours, even though they wore badges to say they were doing work of national importance. On the other hand, some of our men were supported by their friends and colleagues. We know that William Varley was supported by his former workmates in the shape of his neighbours from Albemarle Road and Cameron Grove. And what became of them all? Apart from Arthur Renison, Maisie Thompson's employee, we know that everyone, with one significant exception, survived the war. Frederick Wickenden unfortunately died of Spanish flu shortly after the end of the war. They all, however, left their legacy. We're standing here in front of the Guildhall, which has remained unchanged virtually since our men walked up and down the banks of the River Ouse in World War I and around that time. This has stayed the same, but we know that World War I has changed us and society before us.